Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to introduce to you all today Ms. Helen Mountford, who has traveled all the way from Paris to join us today. Ms. Mountford is the Deputy Director of the Environment Directorate of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development since 2010. She joined the OECD as an environmental economist and policy analyst in 1997, and she later became the head of the Division on Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Development from 2006 to 2010. A great accomplishment considering that Ms. Mountford was one of the youngest people to be appointed to a managerial position in the OECD, which is a predominantly male organization. Her work at the OECD has included a leading role in the preparation of the 2001 and 2008 OECD Environmental Outlook reports, as well as analysis of policies in the areas of water pricing, biodiversity incentive measures, market-based investment instruments, and reform of environmentally harmful subsidies. She developed analysis of the economic crisis and green growth that underpinned the 2009 OECD Declaration on Green Growth, which was adopted by Ministers of Finance and Economy. Ms. Mountford is also leading the OECD work on fossil fuel subsidies that have been an input to discussions among G20 leaders. Prior to joining the OECD, Ms. Mountford managed a local recycling company in the UK and worked for an environmental NGO in Australia. She is a national of the UK and the US and has master's degrees in environmental economics from University College London, as well as environmental management from University of Melbourne. Her children have especially benefited from her international background, as they both hold 4 passports each. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Mountford.
Thanks very much, Laura. Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. Professor Joyce has invited me to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing at OECD on environmental policies and public goods, and in particular looking at climate change and what sort of policies have the most effect in reducing emissions and climate change. This is an area that we have particular interest in at OECD, and we work across a broad range of countries trying to learn from the different experiences there. But before I start telling you about climate change and climate change policies, I did want to first start with telling you a little bit about OECD. First of all, I have a number of slides and I want to present to you some of our material, but I do want to say, please don't hesitate to interrupt me as I'm speaking. If there's anything that you've got a question about or want to clarify, if I speak too quickly or too slowly, let me know. But I did think I'd start with something about OECD. Can I first have a show of hands in the room? How many people actually know what the OECD is? Anybody? Yes? Okay, some. Okay, not that many. So I'll get into a little bit about what OECD is, and then talk to you a little bit about how will business as usual, economic growth, that's what we expect to happen if we don't put in place new policies. How will that actually affect climate change? Then talk a little bit about what sort of policies are needed to drive investments in cleaner alternatives. What can we learn from existing policies in different countries? What's working, what's not? And what more is needed, and where are we going to with this? So first of all, let me say a little bit about the OECD. Now the OECD, the aim of our organization is to help countries to put in place better policies for better lives. That's what we're aiming at. Now we cover all sorts of policy areas other than defense and culture. Those are the 2 that we don't cover. So I work on environmental policy, but we also have colleagues who work on tax policy, economic policy, trade policy, education, etc. What we aim to do is offer evidence-based and independent, impartial policy advice to different governments. It's a multidisciplinary approach that we take. We try and draw on the work in different directorates or different committees in the organization. And so, for example, a lot of the work in my team in the Environment Directorate, we're doing together with those colleagues on trade, on tax policy, in different areas, agriculture and environment, etc. One of the things we do is we collect a lot of data and information, and we monitor the progress of countries in implementing their commitments or their policy targets. So that's peer reviews we use where we assess how different countries are doing. Now that assessment takes place in a meeting room where we have, normally we don't have meeting rooms like this, we have a round table or a square table. And we will have countries, delegates from different countries around the table, 34 to 40 countries, who will all be listening to the assessment of an individual country. And through that, they're able to use peer pressure and learn from each other's experiences to help countries actually go further than what they've been able to do so far. We also set best practice standards. We have a number of different legal instruments that are adopted at the OECD. But one thing we do not do, which a lot of people ask, is provide any financial assistance. We leave that to the World Bank and to development banks, regional development banks and national development banks. Now, the OECD actually started in 1961. It came out of an approach to help through the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe after the Second World War, and then moved on to a number of different policy areas. We are based in Paris, but have a couple of centers in different countries. Most of these are outreach centers. They're very small. Our DC center, for example, has about 5 staff members. That's all. We have 34 member countries now, and we have about 2,500 staff members. Most of our work is done through specific committees. So we have about 300 expert committees. And these, for example, I work with the Environment Policy Committee. So this would have, we would meet 2 times a year on average, and we would have delegates from member governments, from our member country governments, coming to meet, share experiences, learn from each other, discuss our analysis, etc. In addition to our committees, we also have 6 specific working parties on environment, looking at different issues, biodiversity, climate change, etc. So in terms of our countries, this shows the dark blue are the OECD member countries, and we have membership talks, session membership talks with Russia, Colombia, and Latvia underway now. We have key partners, the major emerging economies, the BRICS there, and we have some very recent members that have just joined the OECD in the last couple of years as well, as part of that 34. We also work very closely with other organizations, with business, NGOs, and trade unions. So they, for example, would participate in our different committee meetings, which can often be a good check for some of the policymakers in the room when business stands up and says, well, actually, you know what, that's not going to work. We can't do that. Or NGOs say, you're not doing enough. So they're in the room and participating in the discussions. I won't go through this list, but this is the range of issues that we cover in the Environment Directorate in terms of environmental issues. So there's quite a few here. And some of the ones that I'm going to draw on today are, for example, our environmental outlooks and modeling work. We have some results there, some of the work we do on policy instruments, and of course the work on climate change, those sorts of areas of work. So first of all, I'll say something about this, and then I'll ask if you've got any questions on these. In terms of the environment work and the value added, as I said, a lot of the work we do is rigorous fact-based analysis and advice based on data and information. We try and share best practices across countries. We do a lot of case studies on specific country policies, what worked, what didn't, why it didn't work if it didn't work. The peer reviews, we developed some practical instruments and tools, some soft law, some recommendations or agreements. And we do a lot of analysis and discussions which help support the multilateral international environmental agreements. So for example, on climate change, we have a regular group where we bring negotiators together in Paris outside of the negotiations to have frank discussions on some of the issues they're discussing in a more technical way at OECD compared to what they can do in negotiations where it's very formal and they have to stick with very firm country positions. Now, before I go on to some of the results of some of our analysis, are there any questions about the OECD and how we work? Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming today. It's really interesting so far. I was looking at the map before of the OECD member countries, and I noticed that there aren't any countries in the OECD in Africa, excluding South Africa, and I was wondering whether the OECD had any plans to try to include other countries from Africa or how that process works.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So in fact, the way OECD emerged, it was initially Europe and then it spread to other countries that were fairly advanced economies, democratic, and with market-based economies. So you'll see that's where our membership is, and it has been expanding more and more to different regions. Particularly, we've had quite a few new countries from Latin America and a few from Asia Pacific. At the moment, we don't have any member countries in Africa, so South Africa is one of our key partners. They're invited to all of our meetings. but they're not a member country as such. We do have a number of program areas where we actually engage with a broader range of countries. So one of the ones in my directorate is work that we do on environment and development, and particularly looking at climate change adaptation. And in that group, for example, we actually have quite a few delegates from different African countries because it's a really key issue there. So there is engagement, but on a more sporadic basis. At the moment, there's no intention, I think, to go to expanding the membership further in African countries, but we're certainly engaging with a number of countries. Any other questions about OECD? Otherwise, I'll move on to some of the results from our work. So to set the background in terms of what's happening on climate change and where the policies need to be and where they are, I wanted to share with you some results from our 2012 OECD Environmental Outlook. This is a modeling-based analysis looking out to 2050. What are the major drivers of economic and social and sectoral drivers of environmental change? So just to give you a little bit of background, we have the sort of economic growth projections that we see under business as usual again. And this would be that the economy would basically be quadrupling by 2050. And you can see where the major areas of growth are. It's certainly in this dark green area. That's the BRIC countries, the major emerging economies. There's a lot of growth. And in what we call ROW, rest of the world, which is the top bar there. For OECD countries, it's a lot more stable. We're not seeing major new growth in these countries. Now, one of the major drivers or big drivers of environmental issues and environmental challenges is actually consumption patterns. And what we are seeing is that while we're expecting about 3 billion more people to join the planet, we'll actually have a much greater, about 2 billion, we'll have much more growth in terms of middle-class consumers globally. So this shows you in the different areas where there's growth in middle-class consumers. And particularly you see there's a lot of growth in Asia Pacific to 2020. And then as you go out to 2030, there's 3 billion more consumers, middle-class consumers. And that's going to drive a lot of things such as water use, energy use, purchasing of different types of equipment, different types of goods, waste production, etc. So that's a major driver of environmental change. As a result of some of these trends, what we see in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is that we would expect by 2050 they'd be about 50% more greenhouse gas emissions. Now this is, in some ways this reflects some efficiency gains because we'd expect about 70 to 80% more energy use, but 50% more greenhouse gas emissions. And again, not surprisingly, a lot of the growth is actually in the emerging economies where you have more GDP growth and you have greater populations. It's fairly stable in the OECD Annex 1 countries. That's the Annex 1 under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But of course, it's the OECD countries that are responsible historically for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions to date. Now, what do we need to do about this? How do we need to shift the picture? Well, what we see is the baseline. If we continue with this business as usual growth, we would expect that by 2100, we would have a world at which the average temperature, global temperature, is 3 to 6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, internationally, countries have agreed to try and keep temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So in the current trajectory, by 2100, we're already way off track from this goal. So what would we need to do in terms of emissions to get to 2 degrees Celsius instead? That's what we'd need to do. To actually reach that international target, this is what would have to happen with our emissions. So as you can see, that's quite dramatic. And basically in the second half of the century, you're looking at going towards almost zero net emissions. It's quite a shift from where we would otherwise be going. Now, if we don't make that shift, what's going to happen? Well, this figure from the Outlook shows you where there's particularly the impacts in terms of temperature change. And one of the things you'll see is that the higher increases in terms of temperature change, where it's above 3.5 degrees Celsius, it's a lot of the regions which are very poor and which are already quite heavily populated, and some of them are going to be even more populated by that stage. That's where we're expecting further population growth, which means there's going to be even more economic damage and social and human health and welfare impacts in those sorts of regions. Just one example comes from the area of water stress. And this is not only driven by climate change, it's also driven by where populations are growing. But for example, you can see that in terms of those people who are under severe water stress, at the moment, or recently, it's been about 1.6 billion people worldwide, but we expect that by 2050, this would grow by another 2.3 billion people who would be living in regions which are subject to severe water stress. So the pressures in terms of having access to water for human needs, competition for water between agriculture, between with industry, etc., is going to be significant. Now, at the same time, one of the things that we get challenged with a lot, and a lot of people raise, is, well, there is technical progress, we're having efficiency gains, isn't this actually already putting us on a much better track? And there are some significant progresses that we've seen in recent years. I mean, one of the examples is in terms of PV, photovoltaic modules. The costs of these have come down enormously in recent years, by about 99% since 1977. We're also able to use solar power much better than we were able to before in terms of storage, in terms of ensuring baseload electricity. There's a lot of progress in this area, and we're seeing that in terms of renewable energy. I think last year was the first year where we had just as much new investment and new development of renewables as we did fossil fuels. So we're starting to shift the picture in these sorts of ways. And that has had some impacts. We've actually already seen historically that there's been significant efficiency gains in terms of energy and climate change. But I want to show you what happens if we continue with what we've seen in the recent years in terms of efficiency gains. Where would we be at with that in 2050, for example? So in 2010, this figure shows you how much greenhouse gas emissions there are in terms of the economy of different countries. So we've got the rest of the world there, and you can see that it's actually quite high. It's about almost 1 kilogram of CO2 emissions per dollar of the economy. OECD countries are more efficient. It's lower down. It's about 0.4. That's not surprising because our countries, having had historic responsibility for climate change, have been taking quite a bit of action to tackle it. BRICS in between and the world average there. And now just based on the efficiency gains we've seen in the past, if we project those out to the future, we see that everyone's becoming more efficient, right? They're coming down, which is excellent. What you see here is in terms of GDP growth, we've got the emissions coming down per GDP growth quite significantly, so that by 2050, everyone is well below what OECD countries were at already today. So that's fabulous. But what's happened in terms of total emissions over this time? With all these efficiency gains, we've gone to 81 gigatons of CO2 emissions globally compared to 48 gigatons at the moment. So we've still almost doubled carbon emissions while at the same time realizing those fairly enormous efficiency gains. So that's not going to be enough. This is our Secretary General looking particularly serious in this photograph. He does smile sometimes. But this is from a speech that he gave last autumn in October with Lord Nick Stern, who you might know. He wrote some fairly seminal work on the economics of climate change a few years ago. And basically, he was trying to emphasize yet again that, whatever policy mix we do, we need to find a coherent mix of policies which can lead to the complete elimination of emissions in the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion by the second half of the century. Now, the figure I showed you at the start, the modeling projections, almost all the other modeling projections out there will show you the same thing. That's pretty straightforward. But hearing it said by somebody who's the head of the economics organization like the OECD was quite a shock, and we had quite a strong reaction, both from the press and also from some of the countries on this, because the challenge is enormous. It's there, it's quite clear from the analysis and the work that that's what we need to do, but it's still a real shock to most people how much needs to be done. So what can we do about it? Well, one of the things we've been studying at OECD for a while is green growth, and what sort of policy mix, how can you combine different policies to actually try and move towards greener growth to help tackle climate change and other environmental challenges. And we've basically divided the different policies up into a set of different approaches. So one is making pollution more costly, putting a price on pollution. Certainly putting a price on carbon emissions is one of the big priorities there. And you can do that through various different approaches, including taxes, but also cap and trade systems, emission trading. 2, value and price natural assets and ecosystem services. So again, we do this through, for example, water pricing, but also national park charges, payments for ecosystem services, etc. 3, remove environmentally harmful subsidies, and this is something I will share some of our results on fossil fuel subsidies with you, because this is very important. It's basically the opposite of pricing. At the same time as we're trying to encourage countries to put a price on carbon, they're actually subsidizing carbon emissions in some cases. So we're looking at how can you actually do both of these, remove the subsidies to emissions, put in place prices. While we put a strong emphasis on pricing, at the same time, that's not going to be enough. You're not going to be able to reach everyone and all sorts of emissions through that. You do need effective regulations and standards. For example, in terms of energy efficiency in buildings, there's some very strong evidence that some people will not invest in energy efficiency themselves in buildings. For example, if you have a situation where you have a tenant and you have a landlord, there's somebody who's renting an apartment, for example, they don't have a strong incentive to invest in insulation because they don't own the apartment. On the other hand, the landlord doesn't pay the electricity bills. So they don't want to invest in insulation either. So you have this problem where it falls between the cracks. Nobody has the incentive. So putting in place regulations and standards, or in some cases using government incentives to help promote insulation or energy efficiency in buildings will be an important complement to whatever pricing you have in place. Encourage green innovation. This is essential. As I said, we've had huge efficiency gains and a lot of innovation in recent decades, but we need much, much more. We need step changes, we need dramatic shifts in order to be able to move forward. And one of the things we need is a lot more public support for research and development as well. And I'll show you some facts and figures on this as well, linked to fossil fuels and renewables, which are quite stark. And then also facilitate informed consumer choices. And some of the work that we're looking at now, we're doing some what's called behavioral economics. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. I see some nods, good. So trying to look at, we have our wonderful theories about environmental policies and how they work, but actually in some cases you can put in place some small incentives, some small measures which can help nudge consumers to do even more than what our theory would say. In other cases, it may work the other way, and so you want to understand this. One of the ones that's been very successful, I think, in the US as well as in the UK, and we've got some studies going on in Australia now, is just actually telling people not only what their own energy bill is, but how their energy bill compares to their neighbors. Because people like to do better than their neighbors. They like to, see that they're doing better than the average or whoever else. And what they've found is that often by doing this, you can get people to dramatically increase how they actually conserve energy. Because if you find out that your energy bill is X and your neighbors on average tend to be having much lower energy bills, people become competitive and they want to reduce their energy bill. Now, the good thing is the perverse does not hold true. So if you get told that your energy bill is actually much better than your neighbors, what tends to happen is people actually are complacent and they stay there, or they even do more because they think, well, I'm already on a winning streak, I can do more. So it's actually one of those areas where there's some very interesting impacts, and it actually can have quite a strong effect environmentally. So we're looking at how can you combine more information to help consumers and producers actually make better choices, eco-labeling and this sort of information, which can help, again, to complement the other policies in the mix. I just wanted to highlight this because we were talking about innovation, and I don't have much information on innovation here in this presentation, but this is some analysis we did, which actually came out with some fairly surprising results for us in terms of patenting activities. So this is the extent to which businesses were patenting new technologies. And what you can see here in the dotted black line is the trend in patenting of all technology sectors. And this is global. It covers a number of different patenting offices around the world. And so you can see that dotted black line, and it's slowly increasing from 1975 over to 2007. But what's interesting is what happened in terms of climate-related technologies, whether it was wind power, fuel cells, solar PV, lighting and building energy efficiency, etc. And what we find is around about 1997, there's quite a sharp increase in patenting activities in these. Now that is when the Kyoto Protocol was actually adopted and came into play. Now, we all know today that the Kyoto Protocol did not send anywhere near a strong enough signal in terms of climate change and what action people would take, but it did have quite a dramatic effect on businesses in terms of their patenting activity for these. What you also see towards 2007 is it's starting to drop off dramatically. And that is when countries were starting to negotiate the next round, and things were looking really pretty bleak. So the signal to business was, you know what, there might not be much coming out of this. No point investing more in terms of innovation. So it's just one of the things. Yeah, sorry. Please go ahead now. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just had a quick question about the effects of patenting on technological development. Yeah. I'm not an economist, so this may be a very simple question, but do you find that patenting sort of decreases the competition amongst businesses for this type of technology and therefore slows down the production of new technology, or does it actually help encourage and incentivize development?
Patenting normally helps to encourage and incentivize innovation, having a strong patent regime, intellectual property rights regime, because basically what it allows is that companies get the benefits of having developed new technologies. Develop the new technologies, they register them. Others can use the technology, but only if they pay them because they have the rights. Now the rights it's a limited time period. So in fact, normally it helps to increase activity in this area. At the same time, what we also find is if patenting itself is actually quite complicated, that can actually drive people away. Or if they think there's no benefit or no interest from others to actually adopt the technology, they don't bother to patent, it doesn't get into the market. There's also some questions that we're looking at in terms of international transfer of technologies, which is very important, particularly between developed and developing countries, making sure that these are accessible. And patenting sometimes can have perverse effects there. Sometimes it can actually help, sometimes not. So it's one of those areas that we're doing some more work on that. So it's not, I would say, oh, yep, go ahead. Sorry. Patenting isn't necessarily the best indicator of innovation, but it's one of the few ones we actually have to be able to look at. So, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here. I have a question about what's going on with the wind power in this particular graph. I'm curious about why the wind power seemed to have a different sort of trajectory than the other energy sources.
I think, and I'd have to go back and either look at my notes or somebody in the audience might be able to help me with this. I actually think the wind power, what happened there is there's been a couple of schemes in a number of countries, including the US, but also in a number of other countries, to support wind power. And in these years, there was a lot of variation and there's a lot of uncertainty. And in some cases, some of the subsidies and government support were cut for 1 year, or at the last minute were renewed, but it wasn't clear whether they were going to be renewed. So in fact, wind is one of the areas where there's been a huge variation in government support and policies. And so one of the things we say is that you need clear long-term policy signals, and that's one where there hasn't been. So you actually see that across the investment figures as well. There's been huge variations in investment in wind from year to year in different regions just because of the variation in the policies. Anything else? No? Okay. So now I'd like to share with you a little bit of results from a couple of our books where we basically try and provide some evidence on what's happening in terms of government policies, both in terms of fossil fuel support and subsidies, and also in terms of taxing energy use and what's happening across different countries. So first of all, remember the slide about what sort of policies we're meant to put in place. We're meant to put in place taxes, and we're meant to remove fossil fuel subsidies. Well, what are governments actually doing in OECD countries and around the world? This is what we're doing in terms of renewable subsidies globally. In 2012, our colleagues at the International Energy Agency in Paris estimate these were $82 billion. So that's pretty impressive. They also had government R&D to renewables and to energy efficiency, and this is cumulative over about 3 or 4 years, which was adding up to about $17 billion. So not bad. Then there was fossil fuel subsidies. In developing and emerging economies alone, subsidies to consumption were $544 billion in 2012. In OECD countries, we had subsidies to company car and parking tax benefits which amounted to $30 billion, or over $30 billion. And we had fossil fuel support in OECD countries of $55 to $90 billion. And then there's the government R&D. So again, over the same period as the governments were giving R&D support to renewables and energy efficiency, they were providing $22 billion in R&D to fossil fuels. So when you look at it on balance, there's still a huge prevalence in terms of the support and the subsidies and the research and development that is focused on fossil fuels rather than on renewables and energy efficiency. So that is what we're seeing, and we're trying to work with governments to shift that balance, to move away from that. Now, in terms of the OECD countries, and I think I'd circulated to colleagues here our summary of our fossil fuel support book. What we see in OECD countries is this is how the support has been going over this period. Petroleum was getting about 71% of the support, but there's quite a bit to coal and natural gas. I think if you actually looked at more recent data, we'll be updating our data next year, I think, next year or early the year after. You'll find that natural gas has gone significantly more. There's been a gas boom, and quite a few countries, OECD countries, are supporting this quite strongly. And in terms of the measures, a lot of it's going to consumers, some of it's going to producers. And in the US, for example, President Obama has been trying for a number of years to get rid of I think it's about $4 to $5 billion, which goes to support oil and gas exploration and production. So basically, the American people are subsidizing oil and gas companies in their exploration and production by about $4 to $5 billion per year. Now, you can question whether that's money well spent. In terms of our analysis, we've looked at what are the impacts of actually removing these subsidies and these kind of support mechanisms. And this is analysis we've been able to do looking at the consumer subsidies in emerging and developing countries only. And if you actually remove these in these countries, this is the benefit you would have to GDP. So in Indonesia, for example, the GDP in 2050 would be about 5% higher than you would have otherwise. And all the way through, you can see that there's benefits to the countries of phasing out the subsidies in their own countries in terms of GDP impacts. But of course, it's not the actual economic impacts that people are worried about. That's not the reason why they keep these subsidies in place or put them in place in the first place. It's mainly about the social impacts. And it's often for emerging and developing countries, it's countries where there are no social safety nets initially, and putting in place subsidies to gasoline or to electricity is a way of helping to support the poor. So that is why they've been put in place, and that's why it's very hard to get rid of them. But what we found, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention this, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we would have 6% less greenhouse gas emissions if we phase these out. So it's environmentally good and also economically. Yes, sorry.
Hi, my name is Naraini. Thank you for being here.
Yes,
Could you explain why removing subsidies would have a positive impact on the GDP? Would people be using more fossil fuels without the subsidies, or is there some other relation there?
Now, these are actually subsidies to consumers. So if you remove the subsidies, that would make gasoline or electricity more expensive, so they would use less of these in most cases. Now, the reason it would benefit them economically is because it's a distortion in the market. Basically, you have a market price and what would be the appropriate price according to the market, and then governments are saying, well, instead of letting companies charge that price, we're going to say that they can only charge this price instead. So people are overusing gasoline or electricity compared to what the optimum is. So once you actually start to pull that out, you would find that GDP would go up because it's a distortion. It's a distortion. So as I'd mentioned, the main reason it's put in place, these are put in place, is for social reasons in order to help protect the poor. But one example we have here, and this is quite representative of many countries, this is from Mexico. And this shows how petrol and diesel, so gas and diesel fuel subsidies, who they actually impact on in terms of the income deciles, and also residential electricity subsidies. And so what you find here is that when you look at the 10th income decile, this is the 10% of the richest in the Mexican population. And they get almost 20% of the subsidies to petrol and diesel. That follows through to them. Those are the people who, of course, have the largest cars, who have larger houses, who have many televisions, washing machines, etc. So it's not surprising, but that is where the majority of the subsidies go. Now you look at the poorest, and if you take the poorest 30% and add that up, they're still not even getting as much of the subsidies as the top 10%, the 10% richest in the country. So this is really what you see in most countries. Now, of course, if you took the subsidies away, the poorest would suffer. If you just took these away now, it's not very much they're getting compared to the rich, but they would suffer. So one of the things we do is work with countries to look at a strategy for reforming subsidies while also putting in place social safety nets or other systems in terms of direct cash payments, something to help support the poor, because you can't just take these away. If you do, what happens is you get rioting in the streets and people protest and the government gets overthrown. And we've seen that in quite a few countries with energy subsidy reform. So you need to have a good strategy to actually reform them while taking care of the poor. Now, what about pricing? That's the flip side. Once you get rid of your fossil fuel subsidies, you also need to put in place pricing for carbon. So what do we see? Now, this is from a database that we have of not just OECD countries, but also a number of non-OECD countries. And what you can see here is the taxes on energy, what's going across there. And in fact, actually, this is Mexico, which is negative because their fossil fuel subsidies are done through a sort of pricing mechanism linked to the tax. It's a tax smoothing mechanism. So they've turned up negative in the graph. Motor vehicles is another popular way of putting in place environmentally related taxes. And then there's some other taxes as well, for example, on water use or waste use in some countries. So you can see that there's actually quite a variation in terms of to what extent countries are taxing environmentally related bads. And then this is in terms of percent of GDP. Now the interesting thing, of course, is here with the red arrow is the United States. And it's one of the countries, certainly amongst the OECD countries, which puts in place the least amount of environmentally related taxes. So if you actually look over here, we've got, there we go, Brazil there, which has quite significantly higher levels of environmentally related taxes. And I think we've got Costa Rica and Dominican Republic and South Africa as well, which are quite significantly higher in terms of environmentally related taxes than the US. So I know in the US, the tax is a bad word, and it's something which immediately throws, everybody throws up their hands and says, no more taxation. But in terms of actually putting a price on environmental bads, there is certainly scope to actually do a lot more here than what is happening now. And one of the things we found, we've done some analysis here looking at what the implicit tax rate per ton of CO2 is in different countries and how many tons of carbon they have as a result. So this is the tax rate going up to about 120, I think this is euros per ton of CO2. And this is how much emissions they have in terms of GDP. So obviously, the further you go out here, the worse it is. This is better. And what you can see is that the higher the tax rate, the lower the amount of carbon emissions. So there is quite a strong correlation here. And as you go out here, where you get higher amounts, you've got lower tax rates, and you've got much higher amounts of CO2 emissions per GDP. So just to show you a couple of the countries on this graph, that's Switzerland, that's Estonia. They have a very carbon-intensive economy in Estonia. It's something that they're trying to switch, but it is quite strong. Sweden has had a carbon tax in place for a number of years, and it's now about 150 euros per ton of carbon, and it covers quite a few parts of the economy, so it's a very good carbon tax. The UK is there, and there's the USA, down at the bottom in terms of the tax rate, which isn't that surprising. Not all the way down at the end, though. There has been some gains in terms of the efficiency of carbon use in the economy. But you can see that there is quite a strong correlation there as you move forward. Yep, sorry.
Are these for consumers or for producers? If it is for producers, I'm wondering what the impacts are, because a company can move from Switzerland to the US to just decrease the amount of taxes they incur.
That's true. They could certainly do that. In fact, this is actually for consumers. This is consumption subsidies. That is a good point. We also have done analysis, and so have quite a few others, on what's called pollution halos or pollution havens. So do businesses actually leap and move countries because of environmentally related taxes or environmental policies? And what we found is that there is no evidence as yet that anyone has done that. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is when you think about it, it's only very few industries where the environmentally related taxes, for example, would be so high that they would actually be more important or more interesting than things like labor costs or the costs of your plant, where it's positioned, or your access to market. So there are a few industries, primarily things like cement, iron and steel, possibly paper production and chemicals, and a few others where there's enough energy that's used in the production system that putting in place carbon taxes or emissions trading systems would really have an impact. But even in those industries, we haven't seen any movement. Now, one of the reasons may be that they're often given lower rates of taxation because of a fear of competitiveness effects. But so far, there's no evidence that environmentally related taxes or other policies have been significant enough to actually shift any industries.
Thank you for being here. I just wanted to ask, when you look at this data, if you were to do more of an analysis on it, how much of a causal avenue do you find with this, or is it simply a correlation? For example, I'm just thinking that, Switzerland is a very different place from the US.
Yep.
And so how much do you think this is actually an effect of the tax versus a huge number of other variables? Thank you.
There's certainly going to be some element that it's other variables, and we have not done that analysis as yet to be able to do econometrically and drag out what is based on the tax and what else. But we have seen, and it's a pronounced enough, I haven't got the other countries in here. I'm trying to recall where Australia is, which is probably more similar to the US in some cases, in some ways. But if you actually look across the range of countries, we've got quite a broad range of countries, some small, some big, some heavily industrialized, some not. And this is quite a strong picture. So from that perspective, we do think the tax actually and the prices, these are energy taxes as well as carbon taxes. We do think these have quite a significant effect in terms of the carbon emissions, but it's probably not the only determinant. And this shows you the same sort of evidence, but looking at the countries, looking at their total energy use and what the tax rate is across the different parts of energy use. So one is the total amount of energy used in the country. And you can see, for example, this is Australia, and almost about 80% of Australian energy use is not taxed at all. It's taxed at 0 rate. And then it starts to go up for different types of energy use. And you get up to taxes, implicit taxes that are effectively about 120 euros per ton of carbon. But about 80% of energy use does not have any tax rate at all in Australia. And that's not unusual. So this is Israel, for example, and there it's just about 70%. For Sweden, again, Sweden's quite progressive in terms of these taxes. It's only about 50% of Swedish energy use, which has almost a 0 rate. Japan, and in Sweden, again, some it's over 400 euros per ton. But remember, this is energy taxes as well as carbon taxes. All the taxes linked to carbon emissions in one way or another. And there's the USA. So again, right down at the bottom, I'm afraid it comes out again in terms of the energy tax rates. And Germany is there in the middle. Now, if you actually look at this, one of the things we've tried to do is start to go into more depth on where are there potentials for actually raising some of the tax rates in different countries. And we've done a sort of mapping of the tax use across different sectors and across different fuels for all of our member countries. And this is giving you the total map for all of the OECD area. But it shows some interesting results in terms of where we put the taxes. Most of the taxes in OECD countries is really on the transport sector. So you can see the effective tax rate in terms of euros per ton of carbon emissions is about 85 for transport. Then you're looking at heating and process use, and it's much, much lower. We're giving tax breaks to these types of oil products, coal and peat. Coal in almost all OECD countries is practically exempt from any taxation, from energy taxation. It's one of the most polluting fuels, and yet it gets almost no tax applied to it. And then there's electricity. And you can see, again, it varies quite a bit by different types of use, but it's very low. So most of the taxes are put on the transport sector. And as I said, we've done this for different countries, and when you start to look at it, you can start to see where there's particular gaps, or where there's lower rates or higher rates, or where there could be adjustments. One issue that's come out of this analysis that quite surprised us and is something that we're focusing on a lot is the difference between diesel and petrol pricing, gasoline pricing for transport use. Now, diesel is more efficient than gasoline, so you can normally go further on a tank of diesel than you can on a tank of gasoline. At the same time, diesel is more carbon emitting, and it's got huge impacts in terms of human health. The air pollution associated with diesel is very high. So for example, in France, where I live, most people use diesel cars rather than gasoline cars, and at the moment, air pollution from diesel engines is killing more people each year in France than road traffic accidents. More from air pollution from diesel than road traffic. And if anybody here has been to France, you would know that the roads are very, very dangerous, and the people who drive there are crazy. So this is actually quite a significant impact. But here you can see that in almost all OECD countries, diesel is taxed a lot less than gasoline, even though it has more carbon emissions. This is per unit of carbon emissions. So even though it's got more carbon emissions per liter of diesel than gasoline, it's taxed less. And quite dramatically so in some. For example, New Zealand taxes it almost not at all. So this is encouraging people to use diesel cars despite the problems that they have. So this is something we're trying to work with countries to actually address. Now the US is one of the few countries where it's taxed at about the same level, and that's what we suggest should be done. They should be taxed at the same amount per unit of carbon emissions. So that is an area US taxes it very little, but does get it the right level in terms of the combinations. Now, I did bring along a couple of books, and sorry, it's in front of you two, so you've got you don't have much space here. I brought along a couple of our flyers and books here in case you want to pick them up later. But one of them that I wanted to highlight some new results was a new book we have on effective carbon prices. And basically what we've done is we've expanded a study that the Australian Productivity Commission did a couple of years ago to look at what are the greenhouse gas emission reductions that are achieved by different types of policy instruments, and what is the cost of those to society, and therefore what is the cost per ton of emission abated. And we've looked at a range of different sectors, and we've looked across 15 countries, OECD and non-OECD countries, to try and get a good sampling. And trying to understand to what extent these different policies are driving real emissions reductions, and where can you get the most bang for your buck in terms of policies. Now the difficulty when you look at this analysis is that in some cases you get very high effective prices, carbon prices. Now this can either mean that you've got a very, very ambitious policy in place, like Sweden with their energy tax, or it could actually mean that you have a very inefficient policy in place, and therefore you're paying quite a lot per unit. But let me show you some of the results of this. So this is, first of all, looking at the electricity sector. And what we find is that, for example, emissions trading and taxes, direct prices, are actually fairly low cost. Here, the emissions trading, this is largely reflecting the EU emissions trading scheme, which at the time of the analysis, I think this was, the date was 2010, was going at about €5 per ton of emissions, so it's quite low. But then you look at some of the other things, and here, for example, if you look at feed-in tariffs, which is a very popular policy put in place in a lot of countries in terms of electricity emissions. This is where people who feed in renewables into the electricity generation system get a guaranteed price for those renewables, which is often quite high. Now, what you can see is on average, these cost about 160, 170 euros per ton of carbon that's abated, that's avoided. But in some cases, some of the feed-in tariffs were over 700 euros per ton for in terms of the emissions that were reduced because of them. So that's actually really quite an expensive policy instrument to use. Same with capital subsidies, and this is sort of subsidies to renewables, for example. So again, it's only some of them that are at the high end, and there are some which are also, oops, can I show this? Some which are down at the low end. So one of the things we say is that you want to avoid the ones that are more expensive. Some of the policy instruments that are more expensive come towards the ones that are cheaper. But also where you are using feed-in tariffs and capital subsidies, we want to learn from who's doing better, who's getting more emissions reduced for less money, and what can we learn from that in terms of doing better policies. Similarly, in terms of road transport, taxes, and that's often not carbon taxes particularly, but just fuel taxes tend to be a lot cheaper in terms of how much emissions you get. Whereas fuel mandates, for example, I think the US has this and quite a few other countries, have requirements for biofuels use in transport fuel. And these tend to be really quite expensive. On average, 440 euros per ton of carbon abated. So those are quite expensive ways of achieving the environmental benefits. And this is one, this shows you what's happening in different countries for the different sectors, the countries that we looked at, and what the effective carbon prices were in the various ones. So that you can see in the US, for example, for road transport, it's still about probably 70 euros per ton of CO2 abated in terms of the price that's put in place there. But for quite a few other countries, it's a lot higher. Oops, can I move? So what do we need to do? That, as we said before, is our business as usual scenario. This is our 2-degree scenario. Now, one of the main focuses we have is how to urgently get investments in infrastructure shifting away from fossil fuel and more energy consuming and wasteful investments, and trying to move towards more efficient and cleaner alternatives, particularly looking at transport, buildings, energy infrastructure. Any of these are going to be in place for decades or even centuries to come. So if we can now shift those now, we can have a long impact in terms of the emissions that are locked in for the future. And I know infrastructure is one of the focuses that you have for this session, so that's something which I hope you'll be able to reflect, this urgency in terms of shifting the infrastructure investments. Now, one thing I did want to highlight today is some of the work we're doing in terms of what is the financing that's needed to do this. And if you actually look at what financing is going to infrastructure generally today, it's estimated, and this is very rough, but it's estimated to be about $2 trillion US. Now, when you look at what financing we need just for development purposes, it should be instead each year about $3 trillion or a bit more than $3 trillion. Going out to 2030. Now, we've also looked at what sort of investment is needed to get to that 2 degrees Celsius world, right? And there's quite a few studies on this, and we've looked across them. And it may be that it's more. It could be up to 11% more than what you need just in order to meet development objectives. On the other hand, if we do the investments right, if we start now and start to put in place the right investments, it actually could be a lot less too. It could be 14% less, still more than what we have now. But what we're looking at is how do we realize those benefits and those synergies and what we call a sort of virtuous circle. So this is a little side discussion, but I just wanted to highlight for you how this can work a little bit. So if we look at some of the policies that you can put in place to promote energy efficiency and low carbon technologies in buildings, for example, buildings and vehicles, this can help to reduce demand for oil and natural gas and the infrastructure that's associated with that. And that can have benefits in terms of power generation and leading to greening, some further greening, some circles there. And then if you actually look at, in particular, the infrastructure needed for rail, for ports, for road, for example, what we find is that, for example, in the US, I think about 40% of rail traffic, rail freight traffic, is for transporting coal. And similarly for marine and maritime transport, a lot of it is for coal and oil. So if you start to remove these from the system, you start to free up capacity to transport other things, or to move, for example, from road to rail for the higher value freights. You could reduce demands for roads. This gets very complicated, and then you can add in other policies in terms of demand management, and you can shift the structure of your infrastructure, not only your infrastructure, but your transport infrastructure, what you're shipping around the world, how you're doing it, and start to realize some of these benefits, which that is how those numbers came to be, where you had a virtuous circle, where you actually had reduced infrastructure costs in the future. It's not just from one small slice, it's by looking at the whole interaction between these. And that's some of what we're trying to do, is to look at where could there be some of those benefits. But let me give you a picture quickly on where we actually stand now in terms of what countries are doing and what this is going to achieve for us. So this is some analysis we did where we just actually plotted what countries have agreed to do, following the Kyoto Protocol, what countries have agreed to do by 2020 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions internationally under the UN system. And what you can see here is various different countries that have agreed to an absolute cap on their emissions, including the US. And the size of the bubbles are proportional to population, but it also aligns over here with what the GDP is per capita. And these are the greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see the US is one of the richer countries, and also in terms of per capita, and also is one of the higher emitting countries. But these are the countries that have put in place absolute caps on their emissions by 2020. And then these are the ones that have put in place intensity goals. So both China and India have done that, and a number of other countries have as well. These are ones which have agreed to reduce their emissions compared to what the business as usual would be. There's a number of countries. Costa Rica is one of them. We've got a couple of others. Where's Norway? Norway should be on there, which have a goal of carbon neutrality. They're going to go carbon neutral. Costa Rica is one of the most ambitious. I think it's by 2021. And then there's some who have other goals. But then we also have all those countries that are in gray, which have not said they'll do anything by 2020. Some of them may still be doing things, but they haven't actually pledged it. But quite a few of these are not doing anything. So this is what we have in terms of a picture now to 2020. And we've been talking with colleagues about how do you start to fill in the gray, and how do you move towards more absolute caps or carbon neutrality for countries to the extent that you can. And this is what you see in terms of market mechanisms, for example. The bluey purple represents where you have carbon taxes. We have those in about 9 countries worldwide now. In Canada, it's in British Columbia and in Quebec, I think there's something. There's those who have operating trading systems, mainly Europe has that. Australia also decided to put in place an emissions trading system. The new government recently has announced that they're not planning to carry that through, but they were planning to link together to the European Union initially. In China, you actually have 7 emissions trading schemes that are being put in place in different regions or cities. You also have some in Japan. You have a voluntary emissions trading scheme, and also Tokyo's put in place an emissions trading scheme. So you have a number of things going on. RGGI is, I think it's 10 US states which have joined together for a regional greenhouse gas initiative here on the East Coast. And then you also have, on the West Coast, there's a West Coast Climate Initiative, which includes some Canadian provinces and some US states. So you're starting to get a bit of a picture forming, and we call this basically a patchwork in terms of market-based instruments on climate change. And it's starting to build up. If you looked at what that looked like 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there was very little. It's starting to build up, but we want to get more of that map covered and interlinked. The more connections there are between them, the cheaper it is to do emissions reductions. So where does that put us? There's a little patchwork of what countries have done so far, or what they've pledged to. Well, again, if you look back at these different scenarios, I've added in a couple of other scenarios we looked at here. And in fact, I'd like to take you to both the 450 core, that one there. That is basically what we're showing you as a 2 degrees Celsius world. Now, there are other ways of getting there. 450 parts per million basically gives you a 50-50 chance of getting to 2 degrees Celsius, or staying within 2 degrees Celsius. So that's one way. That's our core scenario. We also looked at something we called delayed action. So that's the purple one. So basically what we said is, what happens if instead of going on a sort of optimal pathway, countries delay action and only take very serious action after 2020. So it's a little bit slower before 2020, and then it goes down much more dramatically in order to get to 2 degrees. Now, our delayed action scenario is actually putting in place what countries have already agreed to 2020. If we only put in place what countries have agreed to do by 2020, and then thereafter take much more dramatic action, we're on what we consider a delayed scenario. So even all those bubbles that aren't gray is still delaying. And that's what you get instead, that purple line. It doesn't look all that much different from the 450 parts per million core, does it? But in terms of the economic costs, what we find is that in 2050, that delayed action scenario will be 50% more expensive than the core scenario. Because what you've done in that delayed period is actually locked in the infrastructure, which is going to be leading to carbon emissions for a long time. And after 2020, you're going to have to take very dramatic action. And some of that would probably mean scrapping some of the capital that's already been built prematurely. That's going to be expensive to the economy. So that is the additional cost of delaying action. So just to conclude, what do we need to do? First of all, we need to reform fossil fuel subsidies, and we need to do it in a smart way so we address any social concerns. We do need a broad mix of policy instruments, but with a strong focus on carbon pricing in one way or another. We need to complement it with the standards and regulations, labeling and consumer-based information, and research and development. We need to address the competitiveness and the distributional concerns with all of these, but without sacrificing environmental quality. We need to shift investment from the sort of brown towards the green and incentivize good consumer behavior. And we need more international cooperation and finance. And we need all of this very urgently. So thank you. Let me stop there. Can I take any more comments or questions? Anything you want to reflect on from this? Please do speak up. I think I've got one there.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been really interesting. I'm in the transportation group, so this has actually been really helpful as well. So there are a lot of very deeply entrenched interests in our reliance on fossil fuels, on oil and gas, and my group was discussing the panic in the United States a few years ago when the big three almost went under.
Yeah.
How do you think about those, combating those interests, and then also kind of the unintended consequences of the shifts, the dramatic changes that they're going to have to be made?
Yeah, no, that's true, and that's one of the things our Secretary General strongly highlighted in his autumn speech. And if you actually look at OECD countries in terms of the rents that governments get from fossil fuel extraction, it's something like $200 billion per year, which is, it's a considerable amount of money, but, it's not that much. However, when you look at some particular countries, and I think Norway and Mexico, it's about a third of government revenues are dependent on extracting the fossil fuel reserves. And if you look at some of the oil exporting countries in the Middle East, for example, it's much, much more. So they really are what we call entangled in the carbon emissions. The governments are entangled in this, trying to extract from that. They're going to have to find new sources of revenue. There are often political lobbying pressures, as you're well aware here, I know. And so it's not easy to put this in place. What we're trying to do is see to what extent we can bring out the facts and the figures, the information, in order to help make more informed choices, to help raise awareness with the public. And I'll give you one example on this. On the fossil fuel subsidies, the data I provided here for OECD countries, $55 to $90 billion in terms of fossil fuel support in OECD countries. That data did not exist 4 years ago. There was no data on that. Our colleagues at the IEA have been collecting data on fossil fuel support for emerging and developing countries for about 15 years, but there's nothing similar for OECD countries. So some OECD countries themselves had gone forward and actually announced what the support mechanisms were, or put it up fairly transparently on their budget or finance ministry pages, and the US is one that had. Obama has been lobbying for, not lobbying, but pushing for a number of years to actually remove some of these support mechanisms in the US. But in general, that data was not collected. It was not provided transparently. The information wasn't out there. What we've done is also look not just at the federal level, but for example, at a number of U.S. states. And some of our colleagues in the U.S. government weren't even aware of some of those amounts. They just hadn't been efforts to actually pull this data together and present it. So for us, doing that is the first essential step. It's creating the transparency, the data, the information, based on which you can take decisions. Similarly, that data for Mexico in terms of who actually benefits from the subsidies. We had discussions with the new Mexican president just before he came in, about a year and a half ago, just before he came into office, a year and a half ago. Yeah, I'm trying to think back now. I lose time. About a year and a half ago, Peña Nieto and his team, and they came to us, and we were talking about various different issues, and putting up that slide really woke up a lot of people in the room in terms of what the impacts were, who was benefiting. A lot of that information is not commonly known. People think that it's the poor who benefits. And so trying to provide this information is a first step. It's not the final step. It's not enough. We need to get coalitions of people and businesses and government leaders who are willing to step forward and say, no, we need to shift this. I think the question of subsidies to producers, oil and gas producers, for example, coal producers, is something that's particularly difficult. We have seen successful reforms. For example, in the UK and France and Poland, we've seen some very successful reforms, but these were not easy. Even in the UK, it was done fairly dramatically over a very short period under Margaret Thatcher. And there was very little compensation or measures put in place to take care of the coal workers. So you had huge protests in response to this. And in fact, about 10 years ago, so actually fairly recently, there was discussions in Parliament about whether they should reintroduce coal support and coal subsidies, because you still had regions where people were so affected by the coal industry coming down that this was an issue. So you need to do a lot. We're taking some first steps. We're working with governments to learn where has there been successful reforms, what was done, how was it phased in. I think what we need a more transparency, and we need more public pressure to try and shift, particularly where producers are involved. But it's not easy. So we'll start here, and then we've got a couple more. Oh, I can pass that. Done.
Thanks for coming. There seems to be quite a bit of resentment from countries that are industrializing now towards already industrialized countries in reducing these emissions, saying, who are you to tell us that we can't have the same effect that you did while you were going through the same process that we're going through now? What kinds of methods do you use to make this their issue, not an issue of the already industrialized world?
I think there's a couple of things. One is just trying to show that this is a global issue and we're all going to suffer. Everybody will be affected by climate change. Unfortunately, it's actually the poorest countries and the poorest peoples who will be the most affected. They're the most vulnerable, and often in the regions which are going to be hit hardest. So one of the things we're trying to look at also is what kind of financing. There's one thing about who takes action. And where you should take action is wherever it's basically cheapest to reduce emissions. And often that's in emerging economies or developing economies. It's not necessarily them who should pay. And there's various different ways in the market mechanisms and through financing where you can provide support to help pay for the action or to help reduce the cost of the action. So that's one way. That's another way. The other thing we're trying to look at, for example, we're doing quite a bit of work with China at the moment and looking at the links between air pollution abatement and climate change. And in China, air pollution is a massive risk right now. It kills a lot of people prematurely each year, and is going up and up. And in many cases, you can find technologies and approaches which will help reduce air pollution, which leads to health benefits and local economic benefits, and also reduce climate change. So where are there co-benefits to doing this? So there's a range of different ways. It is an issue, and I think there's a strong concern that developed countries are responsible historically for emissions. And we also have a lot of developing and emerging economies turning around and saying, well, you haven't succeeded. Why do you expect us to do more? And what we're trying to show is there actually are a lot of countries that have had successes. I mean, I mentioned Sweden, but you saw quite a few countries where we've actually significantly reduced the emissions as a result of different policies. So trying to highlight those as well. Now, if maybe we can just move along and then go up the way. I think there's a question here. Thanks.
Your talk was fascinating. Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering, when you were talking about raising taxes on fossil fuels, you mentioned that it was necessary to implement safety nets for low-income citizens, and I was wondering what sort of safety nets have been put in place, and do you think that that could be feasible in the United States?
Well, in most countries and in most advanced countries, there is some kind of social security system. So those who are really poor are able to get funding from the government, are able to get, for example, support for food purchasing, or support for education, for healthcare, etc. And so you have some of that in the US. As well as in a number of other countries. What's more difficult is when you're in countries where there's actually no data and information on who lives in different households or the addresses. So therefore you can't have a system like that. You just don't even have the data, how many people are in the household, what their income level is. You have much more informal employment systems in place, so there isn't that information. And there what you're looking at is normally cash transfers. So there has to be some way of registering people. They come and then they get handouts in terms of cash. What we're trying to do is find ways to support those who are poor without linking it to their use of fuel. Because basically by doing a gasoline subsidy, you're saying, well, I'll give you a little bit of money, but it has to be spent on buying, gasoline for your car, or it has to be spent on electricity, rather than saying, you're poor, you need to make some difficult choices about what you want to spend your money on. We'll give you some support to help you, but that allows them to instead spend it on education, or to spend it on clothing for their family, or food, not just gasoline. So trying to look at different ways to do that. And certainly there's a lot of colleagues at the World Bank, I was meeting with them yesterday, who are sitting and are putting in place these systems with countries who are affected now and looking at how best to do so.
Thank you.
No? Any others along this route? Here we go. Good. Thanks.
Hi, our speaker this morning also discussed sustainability, and she brought up the example of a disposable plastic bag in the sense that the effect of charging 5 cents for the use of a plastic bag versus encouraging people to bring it by giving them 5 cents discount makes it really exactly.
This is how I brought the pamphlets to you today.
So it makes a really big difference in terms of behavioral response. And I was wondering, and it's essentially the same as a subsidy versus taxing.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you found a difference in terms of the behavioral response and changes with taxing and subsidizing.
Yeah. A huge difference, and actually you would find almost any European who comes to speak today would probably, or during this course, would probably have something like this, because in most countries in Europe now, and a number of other countries, they are charging for plastic bags or paper bags. It's actually quite low in Paris. I'm not even sure what it is, because I have these in all of my different purses, backpacks, everything I have a few of these. You can pick them up at almost any store for a little bit more, and then you have it for a longer time. One of the first countries that did this was Ireland, and it was very interesting there because they had a huge problem with plastic bags. It's a very windy country, very rainy and windy. I'm actually half Scottish, so I know the weather very well there. And what they were finding is people were getting plastic bags, they're being thrown away, they got windswept, and so this whole beautiful green countryside was covered with what they called white flags, which were plastic bags. So first of all, there was actually a lot of public support for the measure to start charging for plastic bags, because people didn't like that. They didn't like seeing the plastic bags everywhere. But they did put in place a tax, and it led to a dramatic decrease in the amount of plastic bags that were used, and dramatic decrease in the waste. I can't remember the numbers offhand, but we actually have a case study of it on our website, which is about how this did impact in Ireland. And there's a lot of public support. So based on that, it's actually now spread to many European countries. I know the UK has it, France has it, but quite a few others do as well. And you see increasingly everybody just brings around their own reusable bags everywhere. I don't know if many people do here. In the US, do you see that often? Who here normally carries around one of these every day they go out? Okay, you guys are good. So you're doing it. But it's become pretty normal in Europe now. Finally. Okay. Other questions? Yeah? Back up. Okay, then.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My question is regarding the tax system for diesel and gasoline. I was wondering why is it that the countries are taxing more for gasoline? And in that case, you mentioned that OECD is trying to help them to switch.
Yeah.
Then I was wondering how does the process go about it?
Certainly. In fact, what you'll find is some of the, in a lot of countries, they use diesel vehicles for things like trucks, for farm vehicles, for boats, etc. Now, these have often been tax exempted or low taxes placed on them because it's for production and it's because we're trying to support farmers or fishermen, etc. So what happened, certainly in European countries, is those were the primary users of diesel. And you could actually just reduce the tax rates for those specific uses, but they actually generally applied low rates. Now, because there are low rates, more and more car companies started saying, hey, we could actually build diesel cars too, and we could put more diesel pumps in the gasoline stations. And so it's actually spread, and they've maintained the low rates. I think in some countries, they actually did it deliberately. Some of the countries we've spoken to, they did it deliberately because they said, well, we know diesel is more efficient, so you can go further per kilometer, more kilometers per liter of diesel than you can on gasoline, so it's a better fuel. Then people started doing the analysis on diesel and found that actually, while you can go further, you capture that benefit just by the fact that the economic benefit because you're going further per liter you pay for, whereas in fact it is actually more polluting, both in terms of carbon emissions and air pollution. So from a tax perspective, you shouldn't be charging less. But that's something which has only emerged more recently, and that's something. So the way that we're actually trying to work with countries to shift that is by talking to them about this, by presenting this material. France, at the moment, the government is actually trying to shift this. We've been talking to New Zealand in particular. You saw the stark difference where it's almost zero. We've been putting this in some of our reviews of the country policies and making a recommendation directly to them to shift this. And so these are the ways that we work with countries. We go to parliamentary hearings or congressional hearings and present the evidence and then see what they can do. Mm-hmm. There's one at the back there. Sorry.
Thank you so much for your time today. I'm in the energy group, and so we're, as I'm sure many people are really struggling with how to finance our projects, our ideas for cleaner energy, renewable energy infrastructure. And so I was wondering if you could maybe comment a little bit more on the idea of an energy tax, like in relation to the U.S., how far off do you think something like that might be, or how realistic?
Well, I mean, certainly some kind of carbon tax would help to shift the balance on how renewables can be profitable compared to fossil fuels. The other thing you will find is that there's some tax breaks that are already in place which don't really benefit renewables. One of the things that I'm not sure if the U.S. is in this case, but what we've found is that there are tax breaks often for renewables, for investing in renewables. But for example, we're looking at to what extent pension funds and others who actually have some money available at the moment, not many do, but institutional investors have about 83 trillion in assets, $83 trillion, so they can use some of this money. Pension funds can't actually benefit from tax breaks because they're tax exempt already. So they don't get that as a break. So there's some incentives that are being put in place which maybe need to be shifted in order to reach specific investors. There's certainly been various subsidies to help support this. They need to be put in place carefully so that they don't lead to distortions, and you've seen some examples of that here in the US as well. At the same time, you have to realize that any government policy that you do like that, there will be some that succeed, some that don't, and you also can't over-exaggerate it, which I think happens in some cases. What we are seeing is that the costs of renewables are coming down significantly in a lot of areas, and quite a few countries, they're actually now quite competitive with fossil fuel alternatives. Here, I think you've got a challenge where you've got very, very low prices for gas at the moment, but how long is that going to stay in place? What is the future? There's all sorts of different possibilities. So there's various things that you need to factor in into some of those cost decisions. I think one of the things that we're looking at as well is what are the incentives generally for infrastructure investment from the private sector, and what kind of policies can help with that. I already mentioned the fossil fuel subsidies. If we remove those subsidies, we're giving more subsidies now to fossil fuel production than to renewables. Similarly, some of the export credits that you get, I think it's shifted here in the US now with the Export-Import Bank and others, but that's an area where we've seen in the past there's been quite strong support for fossil fuel investments. So some of these broader policy environments need to be shifted. So, but good luck. And if you find the solutions, let us know too. Thank you.